Okay, here's a thought. What if the single greatest untapped force for global missions? Well, what if it isn't some fancy future innovation or a massive new initiative? What if it's actually sitting right there, in your church pew this Sunday?
That's a really provocative idea, isn't it? And it's pretty much at the heart of the source material we've been diving into for this session.
Exactly. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're unpacking a whole stack of really fascinating writings, articles, some research notes, all focusing on the frankly incredible power and, yeah, often overlooked potential of the local church in God's global mission. We've got stuff covering biblical foundations, practical strategies, and some genuinely inspiring real-world examples.
Yeah, and our goal here really is to pull out the absolute key insights, maybe some surprising facts, and definitely the actionable steps from all this material. We want you, the listener, to walk away with a hopefully really clear understanding of why the local church isn't just part of God's mission, but it's actually central to it, and crucially what that means for you as a believer.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So one of the first things that really jumps out from these sources, it's a challenge to, a really common perception. We often think of missions as this sort of specialized thing, don't we?
Oh.
It's for the missionaries, the professionals, or maybe the huge churches with massive budgets, or maybe something like for the next generation to figure out.
Right. It's often treated almost like an optional extra, like an elective on the church curriculum. But what's really crystal clear in these writings is this fundamental truth. Every single church is meant to be a mission-sending church. Doesn't matter about size, budget, location. None of that changes this core identity.
And it's not framed as this heavy burden, which I found really interesting. It's actually presented as a powerful catalyst. The sources suggest that churches may be struggling with, a dimming evangelistic fire or discipleship feeling a bit stagnant or the vision seeming kind of withered. They often find those things actually get reversed when they fully embrace this identity as a sending community.
Right.
Missions becomes like the engine for revitalization.
That connection is so key. It completely flips the script. It's not, oh, we have to get perfectly healthy, then we can do missions. It's more like embracing missions is actually part of becoming healthy. And the sources make a really strong case that the raw materials,
Yeah.
the people, the potential for prayer, the finances, the passion,
Yeah.
it's often already there in the local church.
Yeah.
The missing ingredient usually isn't capacity, it's mobilization. It's
Yeah.
getting things moving.
Right. It's about unleashing what's already present. And I mean, the world itself has changed so dramatically, hasn't it? The sources talk about how things like migration patterns,
Yeah.
digital technology, they've basically shrunk the globe.
Totally.
The mission field isn't just over there anymore. The missionary might be, the refugee family your church is helping settle just down the street, or maybe the colleague you chat with online who grew up somewhere you can't easily go. Exactly. The field and the potential missionaries, they're everywhere, including maybe sitting right beside you on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
And this reality, it adds this layer of, urgency to the whole discussion. The sources highlight that the need globally is just vast and growing, while surprisingly, the traditional pipelines for sending missionaries, they seem to be narrowing in some places.
Yeah, that really resonates if you've ever felt that kind of stirring, that sense that your church has a bigger role to play than maybe it is right now. So if this is that every church is meant to be a sending church, where does the material show this idea actually comes from? What's the foundation?
Well, it takes us straight back to the Bible. These sources argue, pretty compellingly, I think, that the church wasn't just given a mission later on. It was fundamentally born for a mission. They bring up this concept of missio Dei, the mission of God. The point being, missions isn't primarily something the church decides to do. It's something God himself is doing throughout all of history. And the church gets this incredible privilege of participating in his ongoing work.
That great line you mentioned from the sources, the church doesn't have a mission, the mission has a church. That really sticks with you, doesn't it?
It does.
And it all kind of kicks off right there at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. The sources portray this, not just as a powerful spiritual moment, but almost as a strategic deployment by God.
Precisely. The Holy Spirit comes down on this group of gathered believers,
Yeah.
Effectively the very first local church, and then what happens? They don't just sit tight. They immediately start scattering, speaking in different languages, sharing the gospel with real purpose. It's pretty hard to argue mission isn't baked into the church's DNA right from that foundational moment.
And then there's the explicit command, right? Acts 1:8, Jesus tells them to be his witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. The sources really emphasize this wasn't just a polite suggestion, it was a divine mandate. And the key insight here, they say, is that every single person in that original Jerusalem group was a potential carrier of the gospel, right where they were, but also called to go.
And importantly, the material clarifies this isn't meant to be some strictly sequential checklist like finish Jerusalem, then move to Judea, and so on.
Right, not like ticking boxes.
No, it describes it more as simultaneous, overlapping layers, geographical and cultural. The early church, kind of spurred on by persecution and the Spirit, moved outward into all those spheres more or less concurrently.
And you see this kind of strategic thinking reflected in Paul's approach too, don't you? The sources highlight that his, extensive journeys weren't just individual missionary road trips.
Not at all.
They were fundamentally focused on planting new churches, strengthening existing ones, and equipping and sending out more workers. The most sustainable way to advance the gospel, these sources argue, is through strong, indigenous, locally led churches, rooted in their own contexts.
Yeah, Romans 15.19 is one verse they point to, showing the huge scope covered by this very church-centric strategy. And this connects directly to another vital biblical concept the sources really underscore, the priesthood of all believers. Every single person who follows Christ is called a priest and an ambassador. You see it in 1 Peter 2.9, 2 Corinthians 5.2.
And that's powerful because it moves it beyond just like a title or something symbolic. The sources make it really practical, using examples like, the teacher in Ohio or the mechanic in Nairobi or maybe the grandmother in Manila. They're all described as mission agents with unique influence, unique connections, platforms right where God has placed them, their work, their relationships, their everyday lives. That's the mission field.
And this biblical reality, it really challenges the common paradigm we often see in churches today. The sources suggest many churches operate more like a consumer model. People come to receive spiritual goods or services dispensed by the professionals. But look at Jesus' command. It was go and make disciples, not come and consume spiritual products.
That consumer mindset, it feels so prevalent sometimes. So how do these writings suggest a church actually makes that shift from spectators to active participants?
Well, it requires a real cultural transformation, a deep one. The sources talk about deliberately moving from a focus just on sermons to a culture of sentness, from valuing seating capacity to prioritizing sending capacity, and from fostering ministry spectatorship to really cultivating missionary ownership among all the members.
Okay, that makes sense conceptually, but how does a church do that, practically? What are the steps mentioned?
The sources outline several key areas for strategic engagement. It often starts with prayer, but praying missionally. They specifically mention the value of regular, maybe even weekly, intercession for unreached people groups, really connecting the church's prayer life directly to the global harvest field.
And giving, too, I bet.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about, tithing for local expenses. It's about giving sacrificially. The sources talk about the church budget needing to visibly reflect these apostolic priorities, not just building upkeep or staff salaries. It's about kingdom economics investing for eternal returns.
Right. Investing in people and mission.
Exactly. And then there's intentional training. Equipping believers isn't optional if you're serious about this.
Yeah.
It means providing opportunities for things like cross-cultural training, maybe some theological grounding, practical evangelism skills, so people feel confident and able to engage.
And actually sending people consistently, not just randomly.
Yes, sending consistently. The sources suggest churches need clear pathways for members to engage in missions, whether that's short-term trips, maybe midterm assignments, or full long-term commitments. It shouldn't just be an ad hoc thing that happens occasionally.
Okay.
And finally, partnering globally. The material cautions against trying to do it all yourselves, Strategic partnerships with reputable agencies or, crucially, indigenous leaders already on the ground. That leverages expertise and multiplies effectiveness. It's about collaboration, not paternalism.
That makes a lot of sense. Don't reinvent the wheel. Join the work God's already doing through others. These principles are powerful, but do the sources show us examples, like churches that have actually done this?
Oh, absolutely. They look both to history and to the present day. Antioch, back in Acts 13, is presented as the foundational prototype. What kind of church was it?
Yeah.
It was multicultural, vibrant, clearly led by the Spirit in worship and prayer. And crucially, willing to release its best leaders, Paul and Barnabas, for cross-cultural work.
Right.
Antioch didn't see itself just as a place to gather. It was fundamentally a launch pad for global mission.
So that's the first example right there in the Bible. What about later on in history?
Well, the sources highlight the Moravians in the 18th century as just a phenomenal example. This was a small, often persecuted community in a place called Herrnhut in Germany. They were humble, but their devotion to Christ and their commitment to the Great Commission was, well, extraordinary. They sent hundreds of missionaries out in just a few decades, maintained a 100-year non-stop prayer watch.
100 years, wow.
Yeah. And some even sold themselves into slavery to reach specific, otherwise inaccessible people groups. They just showed the immense power of deep devotion, sacrifice, and actually living incarnationally among the people they wanted to reach.
Wow. Sold themselves into slavery. That level of commitment is just breathtaking and kind of challenging, honestly. What about more modern examples? Closer to our time.
Well, the sources mention Redeemer Presbyterian in New York City, famously led by Tim Keller. They were known for really equipping lay people to live out their faith missionally within their secular, urban, professional spheres, in business, the arts, education, really seeing the marketplace itself as a mission field. They trained people to be missionaries right where they worked, Monday to Friday.
Okay, integrating faith and work as mission. I like that. Practical.
And then there's Yoido Full Gospel Church in Seoul, which famously used a cell-based structure. Small groups weren't just for fellowship, they were actively mobilized to reach their neighborhoods and then extend that reach nationally and internationally. It was a core part of their growth strategy.
And the sources note this incredible shift happening right now, today, don't they?
Yes. They point specifically to churches in the global South Africa, Asia, Latin America as being the fastest growing source of missionaries today. It's significantly reversing that traditional flow of missionaries primarily from the West. This is sometimes described as the democratization of missions. This vision of every church to every nation is actually becoming a reality, powered by churches in the majority world.
That's a huge shift. And really encouraging. The sources also mention kind of a composite picture, a church they called Grace Community Church, to illustrate this journey.
Right. It's a story drawing from lots of real experiences. It depicts a church that maybe started from a place of being pretty inward-looking, comfortable, minimal missions budget, members largely unaware of global needs, kind of typical maybe, but then through passionate leadership, through strategic moments in worship that brought the world before them, through purposeful short-term trips that really opened eyes, and through intentionally nurturing individuals' callings, they began to shift, to change.
And what happened as they made that shift? What were the results?
Well, the sources suggest this composite Grace Community Church found that embracing missions actually transformed their whole identity. It led to increased giving towards kingdom purposes, not just local needs. Unexpectedly, it attracted younger people who were looking for purpose and meaning. And interestingly, it even deepened their engagement in their local community because their hearts for the world were expanding. It wasn't a drain, it was a source of new vitality.
So these aren't just like abstract ideas or dusty historical footnotes. These examples from Antioch way back then to the Moravians to modern churches around the world, they really are living parables. They show what happens when a church says, okay, we get it. We are meant to be a sending church.
Precisely. Now, a key question then becomes, who is actually involved in all this sending? Because the sources directly challenge that common misconception that missions is only for the goer. The full-time missionary who moves overseas.
Yeah. The idea that if you're not packing your bags for some remote village, you're not really involved in missions, kind of off the hook.
Exactly. But the sources use Paul's really powerful analogy of the church as a body from 1 Corinthians 12. It's one body, but it has many, many parts, eyes, hands, feet, ears. And the health and the function of the whole body depend on every part playing its role. Mission flourishes, they argue, when the church really understands this interdependence. The eye, maybe that's a leader, needs the hand, maybe a supporter. A sender without a goer is just inert potential. A goer without a sender is unsustainable. They desperately need each other.
That really broadens the picture, doesn't it? So it's not just the goer. What are some of the other essential roles the sources identify in this symphony of sending, as they call it?
Well, yeah, you absolutely have the goer. This is the frontline witness. Often cross-cultural, sometimes in really difficult contexts, whether that's long-term or maybe mid-term. They require rigorous training, deep perseverance, and constant ongoing support from a sending base back home. They really embody the incarnational aspect of mission living among the people.
Okay, so that's maybe the most visible role. Who else is absolutely crucial?
The sources describe the sender as the absolute backbone of the entire enterprise. These are the people and the churches who provide the financial resources. But seeing it as kingdom investment, not just charity, they're committed to consistent, specific prayer for the workers and the field. They advocate for the mission, for the missionaries. Honestly, without strong senders, the goers simply cannot sustain their work. They are completely indispensable.
So the people back home praying and giving are just as vital as the person physically on the field. Got it. Who else?
Then there's the supporter. This covers all sorts of practical aid. It might be administrative help, financial management skills, logistical support like booking travel, maybe healthcare professionals providing medical advice from afar, IT experts keeping communication lines open, people providing hospitality and care for missionaries when they're on furlough. It's about using all sorts of diverse skills to practically undergird the work.
Right, using your professional skills for mission, even from a distance. Makes sense. What about prayer specifically?
The intercessor is described as, like, the lifeblood, the spiritual engine room. These are the prayer warriors who engage in the unseen spiritual warfare. Their consistent prayers sustain the resilience of the workers, they open doors, they facilitate breakthroughs on the field. Their consistent engagement is just seen as non-negotiable for any kind of real success.
And someone has to kind of connect the dots and keep casting the vision, right?
Yep.
Make sure people know about this stuff.
Exactly. That's the mobilizer. This person, or maybe a team, acts as a catalyst within the church, or maybe even beyond. They inspire others, they help equip the congregation, they actively foster a missions-minded culture, they're often the visionaries helping people see their place in the global picture.
Okay. And one more?
The advocate. This role involves raising global awareness, both within the church and maybe the wider community. They highlight the needs of, say, unreached people groups or refugees or victims of injustice or specific global issues that need attention. They effectively broaden the scope of the church's missional imagination and engagement.
Wow. This is really powerful because, as the sources clearly show, it completely demolishes that idea that only a select few are called to missions. It just expands the missional imagination so dramatically. Suddenly, no one is irrelevant. Everyone is part of this body, essential to the mission. You have a role to play.
Right. So the next logical question is, how does a church intentionally cultivate this environment, an environment where people actually embrace these diverse roles and move from just knowing about missions to actually doing missions?
Yeah, it sounds like it takes deliberate effort, not just hoping it happens. The sources suggested several practical pathways, right, for building a real sending culture.
It definitely requires intentional action. A key first step that's often mentioned is establishing a dedicated mission committee or team. This group acts as the strategic nerve center. Ideally, it's composed of people reflecting the diverse gifts and passions within the church. They're responsible for identifying needs, vetting potential partners, and developing a clear, tailored strategy for that specific church's context.
So it's not just random activity, but a thought-out plan.
Sure.
And the budget, that came up before as critical.
Absolutely. Prioritizing the budget is non-negotiable. The sources stress allocating a significant and visible portion of the church's finances specifically to missions. It's framed again as kingdom economics, making a clear investment in eternal fruitfulness, maybe referencing principles like the one in Luke 16:9. The church's financial priorities really do signal its heart.
And you mentioned prayer earlier, being the engine.
Yeah, cultivating a culture of prayer isn't just a nice suggestion. It's described as the spiritual engine driving absolutely everything. Regular, specific prayer, whether for missionaries by name or for unreached people groups, or for wisdom for the committee, is what connects the church directly to the realities and the spiritual battles on the field.
And equipping people is also vital, right? You can't just send people out unprepared.
Precisely. Equipping and training are paramount. This might look like hosting workshops on, say, cross-cultural communication or understanding other worldviews, maybe offering seminars on the theology of missions, preparing short-term teams really thoroughly, not just logistically, but spiritually and culturally, or even establishing mentorship relationships for potential goers, or maybe for mobilizers within the church. It's all about empowering members for confident, effective engagement.
And that probably links back to partnering strategically, I assume, not trying to do everything in-house.
Yes. Partnering strategically is so key. No church, especially maybe a smaller one, needs to figure this all out alone or reinvent the wheel. Aligning with reputable missions agencies, networks, or indigenous ministries who already have established expertise and, importantly, a shared vision. That multiplies effectiveness significantly. Just like Ecclesiastes 4:9 reminds us about two being better than one, collaboration is powerful.
how do you keep the energy and the vision for missions alive over the long haul? It can fade, can't it?
That's a great point. The sources emphasize the importance of celebrating missions. Fueling passion happens through sharing compelling stories and testimonies from the field. Inviting missionaries, maybe those the church supports, or others to visit and share firsthand, keeps the connection personal and tangible. Using media effectively, videos, photos, updates can bridge the distance and make the global work feel real to the congregation week by week.
And finally, it's not just about, sending them off with a prayer and then kind of forgetting about them.
Exactly. Caring for missionaries long-term is absolutely non-negotiable. It goes way beyond the initial sending ceremony. It requires sustained relationships, consistent communication, not just waiting for their newsletters, but reaching out. It means practical support, like helping with logistics or housing needs when they're on furlough, and crucial emotional and spiritual care. Missionaries often face immense challenges, loneliness, stress. They thrive when they feel deeply rooted in a supportive, connected, sending community back home.
Those are all incredibly practical steps. Any church could start thinking about those. The sources also touched on some specific areas where churches can focus their efforts, including maybe the often forgotten people groups, even locally.
Right. Prioritizing the forgotten doesn't just mean those far away on a map. The sources talk about mobilizing believers to engage marginalized communities locally, maybe refugees who've arrived or ethnic minorities who've moved into the neighborhood, perhaps the homeless population. Engaging locally, it embodies Jesus' model we see in Luke 4:8, and it actually serves as vital preparation and training ground for global engagement. Compassion should begin at home and naturally extend outward.
That makes total sense, practicing cross-cultural ministry skills right where you are. What about people's, 9-to-5 lives, their daily work?
That's where engaging the marketplace comes in strong. The sources really challenge that unhelpful, false divide between sacred and secular work. Every Christian in their workplace, whether they're a barista, an engineer, an artist, a teacher, a stay-at-home parent engaging with the community, is a potential missionary. Witness happens through excellence in your work, through integrity, through building authentic relationships. It also includes the idea of skill-based missions, consciously using your professional expertise to serve global needs, either short-term or sometimes even remotely.
And looking ahead, what about the next generation? Passing this on.
Yeah, embracing the future means intentionally preparing children and youth. Children's and youth ministries play a huge role in cultivating a global perspective right from a young age. Through stories about different cultures and needs, through praying for the nations, maybe age-appropriate trips or service projects, it's about instilling compassion and curiosity about God's world.
And often, we hear churches say, well, that all sounds great, but we're just a small church. We can't possibly do all that stuff. What do the sources say to that common feeling?
The sources are actually very clear and really encouraging on this point. Size is not a barrier, period. God has a long history of using the little and the few. They reference passages like 1 Samuel 14:6 or Zechariah 4:10 about not despising small beginnings. Small churches often have unique strengths, maybe deeper intimacy, greater agility to make decisions, stronger relational support structures for the missionaries they send. The sources suggest practical steps specifically for smaller churches, like maybe focusing deeply on supporting just one or two missionary families really well, or hosting furloughing missionaries, or simply fostering a missions reading culture among the members.
That's so encouraging. It really shifts it from comparing yourself to a megachurch to just being faithful with what God has given your specific community. All of this discussion, it really circles back to that fundamental question, why? Why the local church specifically?
Because, as these sources consistently argue, the local church is God's primary, chosen vehicle for mission. It's his design. It's not just a point of ecclesiology, the doctrine of how the church should be structured, but it's deeply missional theology. The local church is the platform God designed to steward this global mandate he gave.
It provides that structure for accountability and continuity too, doesn't it? Which maybe independent efforts lack sometimes.
Yes, exactly. Missions efforts that get disconnected from the local church often lack that long-term accountability, maybe doctrinal grounding, and the crucial ongoing discipleship and care for the workers involved. The local church ideally offers that essential relational integrity and the sustained support system. It's meant to be both the launchpad and the home base.
And the sources seem to link this outward missional health directly to the inward spiritual vitality of the church itself.
Absolutely. It's like a healthy tree naturally bears fruit, right? Matthew 7:17. A spiritually vital church will naturally produce missionary fruit, Disciples will be made and believers will be equipped and sent out. The absence of outward mission isn't just a lack of activity. The sources suggest it can actually be a symptom of inward spiritual atrophy or stagnation. Renewal often leads to movement, to sending.
So those common excuses, we're too small, we don't have enough resources, the sources really don't see those as valid biblical barriers at the end of the day.
Not at all. As the examples we talked about, Antioch, the Moravians, countless churches in the global south today demonstrate the real barriers usually aren't size or wealth. They're often rooted more in issues of surrender, vision, and simple obedience. The Holy Spirit doesn't primarily call based on our perceived capacity. He calls based on our availability.
So wrapping all this incredible insight up, the core question these sources seem to put before you, the listener, is this. What does this profound biblical truth that the local church is absolutely central to global mission? What does that mean specifically for your local church, right where you are? And maybe even more personally, what does it mean for you?
Yeah, we've journeyed through the foundational mandate in Scripture. We've explored some really inspiring historical and contemporary examples. We've defined the diverse and essential roles every single believer can play. And we've looked at practical steps any church, truly any church, can take to cultivate a genuine sending culture. The evidence presented in these sources is just compelling. The local church isn't meant to be just a building or a weekly meeting. It's a dynamic, spirit-empowered community designed by God to be His primary vehicle for taking the gospel to the ends of the earth.
The core call echoing through all these writings is really clear, isn't it? Every single church, regardless of its current state or its size, is intended by God to be a mission-sending church, sending people out and going ourselves. These aren't secondary add-ons for the super spiritual. They are fundamental expressions of the gospel itself in motion.
So based on all the insights we've managed to pull from these sources today, here's maybe a final thought for you to take away and really consider. The world isn't primarily waiting for another big program or another famous evangelist. The sources strongly suggest the world is waiting for the church. God's chosen local, everyday people like you and me to simply awaken and obey His ancient, powerful call to be sent. The Spirit is still speaking. The church must still send. The nations are still waiting. What will your response be?